A flight attendant tried to restrain a black CEO's son mid-flight, but the father turned the situation around in a way that stunned the entire cabin. A flight attendant zip-tied a black CEO's son to the armrest, thinking he could humiliate the family without consequence. He didn't realize the very knife he wielded was a gift from the father, already part of a plan that would turn the cabin upside down. The moment the ties clicked, the reckoning began. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses instantly when true strategy rises. "Excuse me, sir. Is this your son?" The voice came from just behind seat 3, light in tone, but edged with something too precise to be casual. Dr. Tyron Voshin looked up slowly, his gaze cutting through the overhead light glare, as if parsing the syllables for threat. A flight attendant stood there, tall, lean, mid-30s, wearing a Meridex uniform pressed to perfection. His name tag read Rennick Vale, and his smile, though practiced, didn't quite reach his eyes. Tyron gave a measured nod. "Yes, he's with me." Rennick's smile lingered as his eyes slid toward the boy in the adjacent seat. Kullel, 11, cheerful and curious, was zipping open his canvas backpack. The flight attendant leaned in slightly, his hands clasped neatly in front of him, and asked, "Big trip for the little man?" Tyron didn't smile. "He's returning with me from a summit." Kullel beamed up. "My dad gave a speech." Everyone clapped. Rennick chuckled, but it was hollow. "That's impressive. And what about you? Any souvenirs from the trip?" Kullel, eager to share, tugged out a smooth wooden box, the kind that suggested something important rested inside. He flipped the latch and revealed a ceremonial blade resting in velvet lining. The blade wasn't large, but its craftsmanship was striking. The steel shimmered faintly, and an inscription ran along its spine in elegant script: "Clarity before strength." Tyron turned slightly, gauging the attendant's reaction. It was subtle, but his smile froze, not out of surprise, but calculation. "That's a beautiful knife," Rennick said slowly, kneeling a little to get a better look. "Almost too good for a boy." Tyron's expression didn't change, but something tightened behind his eyes. "It's ceremonial, a gift for his academic achievement." Kullel glanced at his father, then back at Rennick, unsure if he should close the box. Rennick rose. "Of course. Just be mindful, sir. Security takes these things seriously, even symbolic ones." He gave a quick nod and walked off, his polished shoes clicking faintly against the aisle's carpet. Tyron followed the man's retreat with a lingering stare. Something about the interaction rubbed against instinct. Not overtly hostile, but off. Passengers continued to board. The hum of idle chatter, the soft hiss of air circulation, and the occasional shuffle of luggage created a low murmur through the cabin. Tyron leaned back, one hand casually resting on the closed knife case now sitting between them. Across the aisle, a man settled into seat 3C, mid-40s, quiet demeanor, a travel pillow looped around his neck, and a wrinkled jacket over a collared shirt. He slouched convincingly, as though ready to sleep through the entire flight. Yet Tyron noticed the man's left hand drift only once, to adjust a small leather badge wallet that slipped back under his jacket. Tyron's mind cataloged it all, positioning, distance, potential relevance. His instincts, honed from decades leading security-intensive projects at Stratton Systems, rarely failed him. The man had the air of someone who wasn't what he appeared to be. "Dad," Kullel whispered, nudging his sleeve. "Can I draw a bit before takeoff?" "Of course," Tyron murmured, eyes still subtly tracking the quiet man across the aisle. "But keep the knife case closed. We've already had enough interest for one flight." Kullel nodded, pulled out a sketchbook and pencil, and began scribbling shapes. Tyron tried to refocus, turning to his tablet and reviewing last-minute figures on Stratton's pending security merger. But he couldn't stop seeing Rennick's lingering stare. Something colder than policy lived behind that man's smile. Boarding continued. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard Meridex Flight 714, estimating a smooth flight to Valor International, cruising altitude at 38,000 feet. Standard fare. Yet, as the doors sealed with a firm hiss, the cabin felt different. Not just closed, but contained. Tyron glanced toward the front galley. Rennick stood there again, talking to another attendant. But while the other man scribbled something on a clipboard, Rennick's eyes were on Cullo. Again, Tyron's chest tightened, not with fear but focus. "You ever flown without your father?" Rennick had asked earlier. A casual question, if not for the context. Tyron adjusted in his seat, shifting subtly to keep one foot anchored, knees loose, ready. It was an old habit from days spent navigating corporate espionage threats and biometric sabotage attempts. "Dad," Cullo said again, voice gentle. "Why does that man keep walking by us?" Tyron blinked. "What do you mean?" "He keeps pretending to check the overhead bin, but he doesn't touch anything. He just looks." The boy was right. Rennick had passed their row at least 3 times during boarding alone. Once with a tray, once with a checklist, once seemingly just to fix a seatbelt sign that wasn't lit. Tyron reached for the call button, but paused. No immediate threat, just a creeping sense of anticipation, like waiting for a chess opponent to move a piece you didn't know was already in motion. He glanced toward the man across the aisle again. The sleepy one, still slouched, still pretending. The plane lurched slightly as the engines came alive. Cabin lights dimmed just enough to soften the mood. Cullo returned to his sketching. Tyron pretended to review his notes. But nothing about this flight felt routine anymore. He looked down at the ceremonial knife case, still tucked safely under Cullo's armrest. The symbol of pride and legacy, a harmless gift, or so it had seemed. And still, the air around it felt charged. Watched. Calculated. Rennick passed by one last time before takeoff, whispering to another crew member, who barely nodded. Then, just as he stepped past their row again, he paused, turned, and said quietly to Cullo with a faint grin, "That's a beautiful knife. Almost too good for a boy." Tyron's brow tightened, but he said nothing. The plane doors closed behind them, and the air seemed to shift. Sometimes danger sits inches away, smiling through uniform. Cullo tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. "That man keeps looking at me weird." Tyron's eyes snapped up from the tablet. Rennick Vale stood just behind them, too close. He was holding a tray of drinks, but he hadn't offered any. Instead, he leaned forward with a calm, unreadable expression. "Your son dropped something earlier," Rennick murmured, voice soft yet deliberate. "I'll bring it in a moment." Tyron stiffened. The wording was peculiar, unclear. "Drop something?" He glanced down at Cullo, whose sketchpad remained on his lap. Pencils intact. Nothing seemed missing. Tyron nodded warily, more out of courtesy than trust, and Rennick turned and walked down the aisle without another word. The tension lingered like the hum of the engines. Cullo curled closer to the window, his fingers no longer sketching, eyes drifting uneasily between the clouds outside and the aisle. Tyron tried to dismiss the moment, returning to his merger notes. But his mind didn't settle. He tapped at his screen aimlessly, reading the same paragraph twice without absorbing a word. 2 rows ahead, a man coughed and adjusted his recliner. A mother shushed her toddler. The cabin was quiet otherwise. But Tyron's thoughts felt loud. Something had shifted. Minutes later, Rennick returned. He carried a small black case, sleek, square, unfamiliar, and without asking, he placed it directly on Cullo's tray table. The child looked at it, then back at his father. "What is it?" Cullo asked, inching away. Tyron reached for it, his fingers cautious. The case was light, too light. He flicked the latch open. Empty. He turned to question Rennick, but the flight attendant was already gone, slipping back into the galley like a shadow behind a curtain. "What's going on?" Cullo asked, his voice rising in a tremble. Tyron held the case in his lap, inspecting it. No markings, no labels. A clean, corporate-style interior lined with soft felt. Not designed for carrying snacks or tools, but for holding something deliberate, something specific. Then the realization hit. He reached down quickly, unzipping Cullo's backpack. Inside was the sketch pad, the pencils, but not the wooden case. The blade. The ceremonial knife he had gifted Cullo for earning top marks. Gone. Tyron's stomach clenched. He turned his head sharply and scanned the aisle. Rennick stood at the far end, arms folded, posture relaxed. The moment their eyes met, the flight attendant smiled, not warm or friendly, but cold and deliberate. He tapped the side of his head as if to say, "Think, doctor." Tyron's jaw locked. That knife wasn't just symbolic. It bore a ceremonial inscription unique to the Voshan bloodline. It had been encoded with a thin layer of biometric threading, a novelty, yes, but a novelty embedded with legacy encryption. A personal project once dismissed as overprotective sentimentality. He'd told no one. Now it was gone. Kal-El, sensing the shift in his father's demeanor, sat up straighter. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Tyron said quickly, hiding the fear in his voice. "You did everything right. Stay close to me. Don't move from your seat unless I say so." Kal-El nodded, small and alert. Tyron looked again at the case. Why leave it? An empty box, a calling card, or a decoy? Either way, it was a message. The kind of message sent not through words, but through the silent language of calculated theft. He rose halfway from his seat, considering whether to alert the captain, but paused. No need to cause panic, not yet. If he was being watched, a sudden move could trigger something worse. Just then, the man across the aisle stirred. Tyron noticed him again. Middle-aged, light stubble, dressed in a sleepy businessman's uniform. A travel magazine rested on his lap, unread. The man adjusted in his seat, subtly shifting his head toward Tyron for just a fraction of a second. It was too small a motion to mean much, unless you were looking for it. Tyron sat back down slowly. Two sets of eyes, one too obvious, the other watching from the edges. He placed the empty case on his own tray table and tapped it once with a finger. Whatever this game was, it had begun in silence, and it was escalating by the minute. Kal-El looked up again. "Is it about the knife?" Tyron didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and gently closed Kal-El's sketchpad. "Not the knife," he said quietly. "It's about what someone thinks it means." As the aircraft sailed through the clouds, invisible but undeniable tension thickened the air around Seat 3A. Trust had been twisted. Gifting had been weaponized. And just a few rows away, someone waited for the next move. Tyron glanced down the aisle again, but Rennick was no longer in sight. Only the grin remained, in his memory, unblinking. The object you gift and trust can be twisted into a weapon of betrayal. A sharp cry shattered the cabin's uneasy quiet. Tyron's head snapped toward Kal-El's seat, empty. He shot up, his heart surging with panic. Kal-El was no longer by his side. Passengers twisted in their seats, murmuring. Then Tyron spotted him, 2 rows down, near the emergency exit, slouched awkwardly with a white zip tie looped tightly around one wrist and fastened to the armrest. Tyron surged forward, his voice cutting through the cabin. "What is this?" he barked. Gasps echoed. Some passengers stood halfway. Others clutched armrests with confusion and concern. At the center of it, Rennick Vale, the overly attentive flight attendant, stood calmly with his hands raised, as if staging a performance. The boy was acting erratically, Rennick announced with careful clarity, his eyes scanning the onlookers. "I had to secure him for his own safety." Kal-El looked dazed but unharmed. His eyes met his father's and filled with relief. "Dad, what did you do to my son?" Tyron thundered, stepping fast down the aisle, his voice low but dangerous. His shoulders tensed, fists clenched. Rennick held his ground. "Sir, please stay calm. Your son reached into my pocket during beverage service. He could have taken something dangerous." Tyron stopped cold, only a few feet away. The accusation rang false. Kal-El was curious, yes, but not reckless. And that word, dangerous, it had been used with precision. Across the aisle, Doran Creel, the sleepy businessman, stood up without theatrics and casually reached into his blazer. The badge he revealed was smooth, metallic, unmistakable. "Sit down," Doran muttered, just loud enough for Tyron to hear. "You'll escalate the wrong protocol." Tyron turned toward him, startled. "Who are you?" Doran's eyes were calm but urgent. "I'm trying to prevent this from becoming something irreparable." Before Tyron could process the weight of those words, Kal-El's voice rang out, sharp and trembling. He took the knife and said he needed to prove something. Silence felt like a trap snapping shut. Rennick flinched, just slightly, enough for Tyron to notice. Tyron's pulse pounded in his ears. His ceremonial blade, the gift he'd given Kal-El to mark the boy's growth, wasn't a weapon. Not in spirit. But now, in the hands of this man, it had become something twisted. Gasps moved through the rows like a ripple in still water. "He said what?" Tyron asked, his voice softer now, heavier with realization. Kal-El's voice cracked. "He grabbed it from the case and told me. He needed to prove something before the landing. I didn't understand." Tyron took a step forward. Rennick shifted subtly, adjusting his posture with trained precision, as if waiting for the moment to play his next move. Passengers around them were frozen, some fearful, some filming discreetly, unsure who to believe. Tyron scanned the faces. Confusion, suspicion. A flight that began in anonymity was now a stage. Doran remained motionless, watching, absorbing everything. "You stole a family heirloom," Tyron said to Rennick, voice low and clear. "A ceremonial blade." "What?" Rennick shook his head. "I didn't steal anything. It was improperly stored. I followed procedure." Tyron turned to the crowd. Would procedure require tying a boy to a chair? Or claiming he reached into your pocket while you were serving drinks? A man near the back stood up slowly. "My wife saw you put something in your apron just before turbulence hit." Rennick didn't respond. His eyes narrowed just slightly. The plane gave a mild jolt. Perhaps turbulence. Perhaps something else. Tyron's mind raced, not just as a father, but as a CEO, a man trained to read patterns. Rennick hadn't acted out of fear. He'd been methodical, each step precise. The empty black case delivered earlier. The subtle separation of Kal-El. The moment of zip-tying disguised as a safety intervention. And now, an entire cabin unsure of what to believe. He turned again to Doran. "You knew something like this would happen?" he asked, barely containing the fury in his throat. Doran's jaw tightened. "Yes, but even I didn't expect he'd use the blade you made." Those words fell like a punch to the gut. Tyron looked back at Rennick. He now stood casually at the beverage cart, wrapping the ceremonial knife carefully in a napkin, wiping it down with slow, deliberate swipes. His hands were steady, his eyes empty, not a trace of fear. The rows behind him remained silent, caught in limbo between justice and confusion. The lights overhead flickered for a moment, just a blink. But Tyron noticed. So did Doran. A whisper of something larger moved through the air like electricity before a storm. Tyron clenched his fists, now certain of one thing. This was never about a safety protocol. This was a performance, scripted with purpose. And the cabin, once a place of quiet return, had become something else entirely. A stage, a trap, and the curtain had just lifted. When protection turns into performance, the cabin becomes a stage for deception. Tyron dropped to one knee beside Kal-El, his hands moving swiftly to inspect the white zip tie cutting into the boy's wrist. The plastic had begun to press too tightly against the skin, leaving behind a raw, reddened line. Kal-El's eyes brimmed with fear, but didn't spill over. He was trying to be strong, trying not to cry. Tyron looked up sharply. "Remove this. Now," he demanded, his voice flat and dangerous. But Rennick Vale stood unmoved, holding something in his hands, a folded towel, cradled like it carried fragile cargo. Slowly, with deliberate precision, he unfolded the fabric and revealed the ceremonial knife. "This," Rennick announced loudly, holding the blade by its wooden handle, was in the boy's pocket. "That violates flight regulations." Gasps spread among the passengers. Some stood slightly from their seats, others leaned into the aisle. The hum of the engines remained steady, but the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted palpably. Quiet judgment thickened the air like fog. Tyron stood, positioning himself protectively between Rennick and his son. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You just accused my son of smuggling a weapon," he said, measured and calm. "That weapon was mine, a gift. You took it from him." "What?" Rennick didn't blink. "A child shouldn't carry something like this," he replied, his tone laced with a cool finality that pretended to be concern. The tension drew the captain into the cabin. He stepped in from the cockpit, tall, with streaks of gray in his temple, his eyes scanning the scene with professional unease. Behind him, one of the co-pilots hovered, unsure if they should intervene. Rennick held out the towel-wrapped knife toward the captain. "I'll secure this for now, Captain." "Standard protocol," he said smoothly. But Tyron didn't move. "You still haven't answered me," he pressed, eyes narrowing. "Why would a flight attendant confiscate a personal item and then restrain an 11-year-old without notifying the guardians or the captain?" "Sir," Rennick said, without turning his head, "he reached into my pocket during service. I acted in accordance with safety regulations." "Safety?" Tyron echoed, the word bitter. "Or performance?" A murmur spread again through the rows of passengers. Some looked at Rennick with suspicion, others at Tyron with curiosity. No one was sure which side to trust. The child was safe now, but the story unfolding felt deeper than just a misunderstanding. There was something off in how Rennick stood, too calm, too rehearsed. He wasn't nervous, he was in control. Or so he thought. Then, from the aisle just behind, a figure rose slowly. The man who had been pretending to nap, the quiet observer in the business coat. He stepped forward and, without fanfare, reached into his inner pocket. A badge emerged, crisp and unmistakable. "I'm part of the Aviation Oversight Bureau," the man said, loud enough for all to hear. "This situation has been under surveillance." Everything froze. Even the captain stepped back a half step. Tyron turned sharply toward him. "You knew something like this would happen?" The man nodded once. "But even I didn't expect he'd use the blade you made." The weight of that sentence fell heavily into the silence. Tyron's chest tightened, his mind racing to interpret the layers beneath those words. The passengers began whispering now, uncertainty flooding their expressions. The blade, the boy, the accusation, none of it was what it seemed. The man, now fully revealed in posture and authority, stepped further down the aisle. His name tag, barely visible beneath his jacket collar, read Doran Creel. His eyes, calm but alert, locked on Rennick. Rennick didn't flinch. Instead, he laid the knife down on a folded napkin atop the tray cart and began wiping it with a packet of sterile surgical wipes, as if the drama around him was no more concerning than spilled soda. The cleaning was precise, clinical, intentional. Tyron couldn't take his eyes off him. "What are you doing?" he asked softly, more to himself than to Rennick. But Rennick didn't answer. The blade gleamed as he ran the wipe slowly across the engraved edge, the family motto catching the cabin light, clarity before strength. In that moment, Tyron realized the knife was no longer just a symbol. Something was being erased, or perhaps rewritten. Doran watched closely, eyes narrowing. The passengers remained silent now, frozen in the tension of truths half revealed and questions unasked. The captain looked between the three men, one holding authority, one holding motive, and one holding silence. Tyron glanced at Cullell, who had stopped trembling but clung to his father's sleeve, as if sensing that whatever had begun, it was only just unfolding. The hum of the aircraft suddenly felt louder. The air pressure seemed to shift, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. Tyron looked once more at the knife, then at the man who had taken it. What begins as ceremony may end in silence. The cabin erupted into a frenzy of voices as passengers stood from their seats, demanding clarity. Some clutched armrests, others pointed phones, recording, whispering, gasping. The air was no longer still. It pulsed with a rising chaos that no intercom announcement could tame. Cullell was in Tyron's arms now, his small frame pressed tightly against his father's chest, the white zip tie still hanging like a broken shackle from his wrist. His breaths came quick and shallow, but his eyes, wide, frightened, clung to his father's gaze with a silent plea for understanding. "Seal the cabin," Doran barked sharply, stepping forward with controlled authority. "Initiate secure protocol now, threat of internal tampering." The captain's voice cracked over the intercom a moment later, formal but shaky. All passengers remain seated. "We are entering security containment mode." Rennick Vale didn't flinch. He stood tall at the aisle's edge, arms behind his back, voice level and rehearsed. "Captain, that man's credentials weren't verified before boarding." I request official identification. This override is premature. Doran raised his badge again, slower this time, so the surrounding passengers could absorb every letter of the holographic watermark. I'm under sealed authority of the Aviation Oversight Bureau, he said evenly. And unless you're willing to challenge that in open court, step aside. Tyron didn't move. His mind sliced through the noise, forcing focus. Two men were claiming authority. One had restrained his son. The other was invoking protocols Tyron had only heard whispered about in security briefings. He chose clarity. He turned to Kal-El, voice low but urgent. Son, did he say why he took the knife? Kal-El hesitated. His voice trembled as he answered. He whispered he needed a drop of legacy. Tyron froze. The phrase was surgical, and impossible. A drop of legacy. It wasn't random. It wasn't casual. That line was embedded within Stratton Systems' unpublished encryption model, a biometric passcode structure never revealed to the public, built around inherited data transfers through symbolic objects. Doran's eyes narrowed. He wasn't after the blade, he murmured. He was after what it represented. Tyron's voice sharpened like the very steel in question. Search his belongings. Now, there was a brief silence, then protest from one of the senior flight stewards. We can't do that without protocol authorization, Doran cut through. I'm the protocol. Override approved. Open it. Two junior crewmen hesitated, then pulled Rennick's crew satchel from the front galley and brought it down the aisle. The bag thudded on the service cart. Tyron stepped forward as Doran unzipped it. Inside, nestled beneath a folded uniform shirt and a faux toiletry kit, lay a fiber sample collector, a small, cylindrical bioencryption scanner, and a set of disposable gloves, still sealed. Doran lifted each item like evidence from a crime scene. He didn't need the knife. He needed your fingerprints. Your son's, too. He planned to extract a dual-match biometric trace. Tyron felt a cold void bloom in his chest. His vision narrowed to the ceremonial knife, now placed back into a towel, still resting on the fold-down tray table. Only two people had touched that blade. Himself and Kal-El. A father's legacy. A son's pride. In the wrong hands, a master key. He meant to trigger an access attempt. Doran continued grimly. Your vault. Your systems. He'd used the fiber imprint from the blade to spoof a dual-layer signature. Rennick finally spoke, his voice smooth, almost amused. You designed a gate that opens with bloodline. All I needed was a sample carried by trust. Tyron's mind reeled backward through the events. How Rennick had smiled when he saw the knife. How he'd returned with the black case. How the zip tie had been placed deliberately. He looked at the band still dangling from Kal-El's armrest. It hadn't been used to restrain the boy. It had been used to align him. For access, Tyron whispered. You zip-tied him to sync positioning with the upload interface. Doran's head turned sharply. What did you just say? Tyron stepped toward the seat, knelt beside the armrest, and felt under its panel. His fingers brushed against something cold, something that didn't belong. He pried gently, then harder, until the plastic popped loose with a soft crack. Embedded beneath was a small black node, its light pulsing faintly. Doran's eyes widened. That's not standard issue. Rennick grinned from behind the gathering circle of crew and passengers. Too late, he said softly. It's already listening. Everything went still. Tyron stared at the device, heart pounding, the echo of his son's frightened words spiraling back through him like a code he hadn't yet cracked. Kal-El's voice, so innocent, had warned him. He whispered. He needed a drop of legacy. And now, as the soft glow of the illegal node blinked like a countdown clock, Tyron understood the full horror of it. The tie was never for restraint. It was for alignment. Rennick sat pinned against the galley wall, wrists bound behind him with reinforced zip cuffs. Despite his restraint, he wore the smirk of a man who believed he had already won. The cabin had grown unnervingly quiet, save for the low hum of engines and the distant shuffle of passengers whispering behind drawn curtains. Kal-El remained huddled against his father's side, his small hand clinging tightly to Tyron's sleeve. Doran stood near the cockpit door, shouting into a concealed comms link pressed to his collar. You still don't understand, do you? Rennick said suddenly, his voice slicing through the tense silence like a blade. His head tilted just slightly, and his tone carried neither anger nor fear, just certainty. This wasn't about harming your son. It was about what you left on him. Tyron stiffened, jaw tightening. He turned sharply toward the captain. Seal the cockpit. Now. And cut the comms. The captain, visibly unsettled, nodded and began inputting the command sequence into the wall panel. Behind him, the access lights blinked red and the cabin intercom died with a soft click. Doran moved swiftly to Tyron's side and pulled him a step away from Kal-El, voice low but urgent. The knife, Doran said, wasn't just ceremonial. Our analyst confirmed it, quantum-coded cipher, embedded along the etching. We intercepted chatter weeks ago. Someone was planning to target your son. Not for ransom, for access. Tyron's throat tightened. He looked over his shoulder at Kal-El, who stared back with wide, unreadable eyes. You're saying I handed my legacy to him, and that became the doorway? Doran didn't answer. He didn't need to. The weight in his silence said everything. Suddenly, Rennick began murmuring something under his breath. It was a rhythmic chant, almost like a string of activation phrases. His eyes had gone distant, as if he was reciting from memory. Lights in the cabin flickered once, then again, casting stuttering shadows across the aisle. The plane gave a sudden lurch, not turbulence, but something else. Something timed. Kal-El let out a soft gasp. Tyron spun toward him. What is it? Kal-El hesitated, then pointed toward the seat where he'd been held earlier. He told me the armrest was part of something, before he tied me to it. The words chilled the air between them. Doran was already moving, yanking open the emergency panel beneath the seat with a snap of latex-gloved fingers. His face hardened. No, this isn't standard issue. Inside, buried beneath plastic casing and foam insulation, was a black node no larger than a pack of cards. It glowed faintly blue at the edges, blinking in steady rhythm. Tyron crouched beside it, eyes narrowing. He didn't recognize the hardware. That was the first alarm. The second came as he traced a thin filament running from the node toward the armrest base. Fiber optic uplink, he muttered. It's pulling signal. Rennick's voice, still calm, echoed from the galley. It was never about the knife itself. It's about what your son touched after holding it. The residue, the transfer. You left your legacy on his skin. The implications hit like impact tremors. Tyron stood, fists clenched. He zip-tied your son, Doran said, voice hoarse, eyes locked on the blinking node. To complete the upload point, Tyron ripped open the panel beneath the armrest, fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon and the urgency of a father. The plastic casing gave way, revealing the blinking heart of the sabotage, a black cylindrical node pulsing red, its glow syncing with the quiet hum of the aircraft systems. Data was already being transmitted. Doran leaned over his shoulder, eyes narrowing. That's it. That's the uplink core. If it hits the threshold, Stratton's vaults are gone. I know, Tyron replied, his voice low, steady, but his breath betrayed the panic rising behind it. He reached in and twisted the node free from its bracket, exposing the flashing core inside. It pulsed faster, as if aware of their interference. Across the aisle, Rennick Vale, still zip-tied, but not yet silenced, let out a laugh that turned several heads. It's already seated, he said, voice smooth, almost smug. You're too late. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. We've initiated emergency descent to Halden Airport. Estimated landing in 12 minutes. 12 minutes is too long, Doran muttered. He turned to the nearest crew member. Do we have any EMP shielding equipment on board? No, sir, the man replied, shaken. We don't carry those for commercial flights. Doran slammed a hand against the seatback. Then we isolate it manually. Tyron's mind raced. They couldn't physically stop the transmission, but maybe they could poison the data stream. His hand shot to his satchel, pulling out his personal tablet. As it powered on, he murmured, fail-safe protocol. Iris 17. Come on, the tablet chimed. Access granted. What are you doing? Doran asked, eyes flicking between the screen and the blinking node. Fail-safe override, Tyron said, typing furiously. If this ever happened, if someone tried to hijack Stratton encryption, I build a voice-locked interrupt sequence. Doran's eyes widened. I need your voice. Mine and Kal-El's. Tyron turned, heart pounding, and dropped to one knee beside his son. Kal-El looked pale, but alert, still gripping the armrest where the node had been hidden. Kal-El, Tyron said gently, placing both hands on the boy's shoulders. Remember our practice lines? From the bedtime routines. Kal-El blinked, then nodded slowly. The ones with the code words? Yes, Tyron said. I need your voice now. Just like we practiced. Kal-El swallowed, then sat straighter. His eyes locked on his father's, mirroring determination with fear just underneath. Tyron activated the audio sequence. A soft beep signaled recording. Together, their voices rose, calm, deliberate, and clear. Clarity before strength, Tyron said. Light before lock, Kal-El followed, his voice trembling but steady enough. Clarity before strength, they said again. Light before lock. The core inside the node flickered violently, red flashing to yellow, yellow stalling into a pulsing white. Doran watched the screen. It's working. You're corrupting the feed. It can't complete without a clean signal. Tyron pressed a final command on the screen. A low beep, then silence. The blinking stopped. The upload had halted. A beat of breathless, quiet passed. Then Rennick screamed. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, dragging his zip-tied hands across a seat rail to snap the binding. His feet hit the aisle, eyes locked on the node in Tyron's hand. You don't understand what you've ruined. Passengers screamed, some diving aside. But before Rennick could reach them, another figure stepped into the aisle, an older man, graying at the temples, eyes wide in fear and fury. Without hesitation, he raised his laptop and swung. The blunt edge crashed into Rennick's temple with a sickening thud. Rennick dropped instantly, body crumpling against the seats, dazed and unmoving. Silence returned. Every passenger stared in disbelief. The man who had struck Rennick looked down at his own shaking hands, then whispered he was going to hurt the boy. Tyron exhaled, heart pounding, head bowed beside Kal-El. His son clutched his arm tightly. Doran leaned over, inspecting the now dormant node, the edges scorched from the internal shutdown. It's done, Tyron said quietly. It won't go further. Doran nodded. For now. The cabin lights flickered once more, then returned to normal. The aircraft tilted slightly as it began its final descent. Tyron looked down at Kal-El, his son, his legacy, his other key, and then, without a word, he placed a hand gently on the boy's head. The silence in the cabin was thick, but it was not fear now, it was awe. Foreshadowing turned inward. The real weapon was always belief in what we passed down. The attendant smirked, confident no one would intervene, unaware that every move he made had already been anticipated, and the father's foresight meant that each action fed directly into a counterattack he couldn't escape. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when preparation meets power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The moment the wheels of Meridex Flight 714 screeched against the tarmac of Halden Airport, the cabin was no longer just a plane. It became a battlefield of controlled chaos. Red and blue lights from runway patrols stung through the windows. Armed agents, uniformed and precise, stormed the aircraft through both forward and rear doors, their boots thudding on the narrow aisles like approaching thunder. Rennick Vale was the first they moved on. He sat uncuffed, composed, his posture relaxed despite the two agents gripping his shoulders. A duffel bag was yanked from beneath his seat and passed to a third agent wearing black gloves. Rennick didn't resist. He turned slightly toward Tyron and offered a slow, unsettling smile. You're sealing the doorway, he said, voice low, tone strange. But the architecture remains. Tyron didn't reply. He kept one hand on Kal-El's shoulder, the other wrapped tightly around his own wrist, as if holding himself back from crossing the line between executive and executioner. Doran Creel stood between them, speaking swiftly into his calms. His voice carried urgency, but not panic. He had known this moment might come. Subject secure. Devices retrieved. Proceeding with tactical isolation. Passenger debrief priority. Vashin, Doran said, stepping past the nearest agent to signal them off. Kal-El was escorted by medical personnel toward a waiting vehicle. He looked back once, his face pale, his arm cradled where the zip tie had been, and Tyron gave him a nod meant to say you're safe now. But safety, Tyron realized, was a shifting concept, measured not in the absence of danger, but in the distance between one threat and the next. In a restricted hangar adjacent to the terminal, Tyron stood before a steel table under fluorescent lights, the only sound being the whir of cooling fans and the occasional click of camera shutters from evidence recorders. The ceremonial knife, his gift to Kal-El, now sat sealed in a biometric container, guarded like a relic capable of summoning war. Doran entered quietly, holding a tablet. Preliminary scans confirm our worst assumption, he said, placing it in front of Tyron. The screen displayed a hollow 3D rendering of the knife, its structure glowing with faint blue lines. Embedded within the hilt were layers of quantum-coded microetchings. They knew Stratton encrypted executive-level vaults with dual biometric signatures, Doran explained, his voice steady. But what they exploited was something you pioneered, generational tethering. Your son's touch completed what your fingerprint alone never could. Tyron said nothing for a long moment. The words didn't surprise him. They hurt because they were familiar. He had built his company around the principle that trust was strongest when inherited, not forced. But now that belief had made Kal-El a target. I gave him that key with love, Tyron finally murmured, his voice taut with restraint. Doran nodded once, and someone turned that love into leverage. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the tinted glass, they saw Rennick being transferred into a black armored vehicle. Even as the agents pressed him forward, he didn't resist. He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Tyron through the distant window like a man offering prophecy rather than warning. "It's not over, Tyron," he called out, his voice echoing faintly past the glass and metal. "The blood code lives." Security personnel shoved him inside, and the doors slammed shut, muffling whatever he might have said next. Tyron stepped closer to the window, but didn't press his hand to the glass. He stood with his arms folded, eyes narrowed, posture sharp as a drawn blade. Doran joined him. "Veilspark wasn't just after your data," he said quietly. "They've been targeting legacy items, those symbolic gifts passed down like badges of memory. Watches, heirloom pens, old recordings, even lullabies. We're seeing a pattern. The past is the access point." Tyron's jaw tightened. "They knew the knife would carry more than steel. They knew you'd give it to him," Doran added, "because that's who you are." There was no reply, only the silence of a man calculating how far the attack had reached and how much of it had already begun before this flight ever left the ground. Across the terminal, Kal-El stood beside a security officer, watching the planes lift into the early morning sky. His face was calm, eyes distant, as if understanding for the first time that the future wasn't something waiting for him, but something that had already taken interest. Tyron saw him through the glass, his own reflection blurring into the boy's outline. Two legacies layered on either side of a wall designed to keep danger out, but not always understanding how it crept in. He looked down at the evidence case in his hands. The blade shimmered faintly through the polyglass seal. "They weaponized a gift," Tyron said softly, but they didn't count on what it meant. The airport terminal's automatic doors clamped shut with a mechanical finality, sealing off Gate 14 from all civilian traffic. Bright yellow barriers were wheeled into place, and a squad of federal agents in dark vests moved swiftly across the linoleum floor toward the parked aircraft. Tyron Vashin stood just inside the restricted terminal, his arm protectively around Kal-El's shoulder. The boy's hand gripped his father's coat with quiet force. Around them, murmurs grew, first inside the terminal, then beyond it, as the first headlines trickled onto news screens. CEO's son restrained mid-flight. Security breach aboard Meridex 714. Stratton encryption compromised. Ceremonial knife or Trojan key. The words crawled across every monitor like smoke from an unseen fire. Tyron remained composed, but every headline felt like a silent blow. He adjusted his coat and guided Kal-El to a private waiting area guarded by 2 agents. There, he sat across from a table littered with preliminary incident reports. The lighting above was harsh, clinical. Across from him, a federal liaison, Agent Marrow, flipped through a digital file, barely looking up. "We'll need a full statement, Dr. Voshin," Marrow said flatly. "The press already knows about the restraint incident. There's no way to contain it fully." "I'm aware," Tyron replied, his voice quiet but clipped. "But I won't allow my son to become a headline. Not again. Then you'll need to control the narrative." Fust. Just beyond a glass wall, Kal-El sat curled on a bench, drawing slowly in his sketch pad. His small shoulders hunched forward, but his expression wasn't afraid. It was focused, processing. A security officer entered the lounge, holding a tablet. "Sir, we've isolated the seat node used for the attempted uplink. The techs are pulling logs now. It appears Rennick Vale had secondary access to cabin subsystems via spoofed crew credentials." Tyron exhaled slowly. This wasn't random. "No," the officer agreed. "And it's not the first." Before Tyron could ask, another presence entered. Doran Creel, still dressed in his civilian disguise, now partially unzipped to reveal his credentials. He closed the door behind him and gave Tyron a short nod before pulling up a chair. "Vale Spark," Doran said without ceremony. "That's what they call the program. It didn't begin with your son, and it won't end with him." Tyron leaned in. "You said it targeted heirlooms?" Doran placed a small folder on the table and opened it to reveal a chilling array of images. A silver pocket watch, a child's engraved bracelet, a wooden rattle, an old phonograph cylinder. Symbolic items, Doran continued, passed down from parent to child. Objects that carry both emotional weight and, unknowingly, encrypted biometric or voice print data. They've been harvesting lineage-based access through sentiment. Tyron's stomach turned, and the knife was one of the few with both quantum signature and biological imprint. "Yours and your son's. Perfect for dual-trigger authorization." Tyron stared at the images, a storm building behind his eyes. "We thought we were being clever, linking security to love, to family. We thought only trust could unlock it." Doran didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced through the window toward Kal-El. "And that's exactly why they came after you. Because what you love most became the keyhole." There was a long silence. A sharp tone interrupted it. The press briefing countdown blinking on the terminal's large central display. Tyron stood, straightened his coat, and moved toward the waiting podium with Doran trailing behind. As he stepped up, cameras flashed instantly, reporters leaning forward with microphones already raised. One of them, a tall man with gray at the temples, spoke first. "Dr. Voshin, is it true your son was physically restrained mid-flight? Do you plan to take legal action?" Tyron's jaw tightened. "That is under review." Another voice cut in. "Was this an attempted hijack of your encryption protocols? Is Stratton's systems now compromised?" "No," Tyron said firmly. "The breach was intercepted and neutralized." Then came the question he expected, the one the board had warned him about. A younger reporter raised his voice above the others. "Will Stratton now discontinue its bloodline encryption model entirely?" The room went still. Tyron's eyes flicked toward the camera, but his voice remained steady, measured, unflinching. "Do you trust strangers more than those who will bury you one day?" A pause stretched across the room like a wire pulled tight. Murmurs followed. Some scribbled notes. Others blinked, unsure of how to frame the answer. But Tyron didn't elaborate. He simply stepped back from the microphone, nodding once, and walked off the platform as the press began to shout overlapping questions. Later that evening, Tyron and Doran met again in a secure lounge, away from cameras and terminals. The walls were matte black, soundproof. Outside the window, Halden's runway lights blinked faintly beneath a rising fog. "They've mapped dozens of targets," Doran said, handing Tyron a second folder. "We're talking about legacy lines tied to key industries, tech, defense, aerospace. They've used old pens, voice-activated toys, even lullabies recorded on vintage tapes. Anything passed from one generation to the next with an emotional charge. Tyron opened the file slowly. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. "We thought we were securing our futures through tradition," he murmured. "We protected what we built, only to realize the things we love most carry the keys." The discovery struck like a silent alarm. Tyron Voshin stood in the middle of Stratton Systems' vault room, an underground chamber where legacy encryption schematics were stored, offline and air-gapped. Before him, 3 glass consoles glowed with audit data streams. What he read made his stomach tighten. Over a dozen internal access requests had bypassed traditional clearance using heirloom-linked authentications. One had been triggered by a gifted pen. Another, by a voice recording embedded in a storybook. And one, he froze, matched the exact biometric cipher used in Kal-El's ceremonial knife. "This was never just about the flight," he murmured. His engineers gathered quickly. The room filled with the faint hum of fans and flickering lights from the vaulted archive walls. Tyron looked each man in the eye, senior encryption specialists, data architects, trust protocol designers. "We've been breached," he said, voice calm but deliberate. "Not by code, by meaning." Whispers rippled. One engineer stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. "Sir, I gave my son an encoded photo frame last month. It had my retinal hash stitched into a family slideshow. I didn't think it. It did," Tyron said flatly. "That's how they're getting in." A silence fell. Then Tyron pulled up a blank interface on the main board and began sketching a new schematic with rapid precision. "We're building something else," he said. "Genlock." He wrote it slowly, letter by letter. Then turned. "No more passive inheritance. No more trust through objects. This new layer will require active, real-time consent, both from the holder and the heir. Nothing gets triggered unless both voices agree. Simultaneous. Verified. Unfaked. Biometric signatures?" One engineer asked. "Yes, but not from the past. From the present." They stared, absorbing it. Tyron stepped back from the board and issued a command. "Bring Kal-El in." The double doors hissed open. Kal-El entered with quiet steps, holding his sketch pad against his chest. He looked at the massive screens, then at his father. "Is this about the knife?" he asked. Tyron knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This is about what that knife taught us." A technician handed Kal-El a small, smooth device, black glass, shaped like a teardrop. Inside it was a digital key with volatile authentication, designed to reject stored fingerprints and rely solely on live feedback. "Can you help us test something?" Tyron asked. Kal-El nodded, though he looked nervous. The room dimmed. A countdown began. The screen read, "Genlock test. Initiate consent chain." Tyron pressed his side. A soft tone. Then Kal-El pressed his. A light flickered. The system paused, waiting. Kal-El hesitated, then whispered, "I don't want another knife." Tyron looked at him gently, not interrupting. "I want to protect things with my words." The system flashed green. Consent registered. Protocol locked. One engineer choked up slightly. Another murmured, "It works." Tyron straightened, the edge of tension still sharp in his frame. He turned back toward the large, curved glass wall that overlooked the city skyline. Out there, people trusted in systems they didn't understand. Trusted in symbols that could be poisoned. That time was over. Word of the Genlock prototype spread fast within Stratton's senior ranks. Within hours, the same board of directors who had once mocked Tyron's legacy-bound encryption began requesting emergency meetings. They filled the conference call queue with urgent messages. How soon can this be deployed? Can this be retrofitted into existing cloud vaults? Will this satisfy national compliance audits? He ignored most of them. He had work to finish. By sunset, a statement had been drafted. Internal rollout would begin within 48 hours. External integrations within 3 weeks. The architects who once downplayed the risk now recited his earlier warnings verbatim in policy meetings. But Tyron didn't gloat. He barely reacted. Instead, he sat alone that evening in the observatory wing of Stratton Tower, watching Kal-El sketch in silence under soft lamplight. The boy was drawing shields, circles, lock icons shaped like open hands. Tyron smiled faintly. The boardroom had finally caught up. The breach had finally been stopped. But it wasn't firewalls or engineers who'd save them. It was the boy they once doubted. The very system they mocked has now become the foundation of their recovery. The son they doubted became the final firewall. Rennick was transferred under strict escort to a black site interrogation unit, the sterile, dimly lit corridors echoing with the faint hum of security systems. He walked with a mechanical precision, wrists shackled, eyes narrowed, but his composure was a thin veneer. As the metal doors sealed behind him, the interrogator's eyes flicked between him and the secure console, already aware that the answers he carried were likely more valuable than any ordinary confession. Rennick, however, spoke very little. His voice was calm, deliberate, almost eerily composed, and every word he uttered seemed measured. Over and over, he repeated the same phrase. He gave it willingly. Each syllable was enunciated with precision, yet carried a subtle weight, as if pointing to something far beyond the physical data he had sought. The interrogators leaned forward, scribbling notes, tapping keyboards, and exchanging glances, recognizing that Veilspark had not chosen its targets at random. Every strike, every manipulation had been calculated. And Tyron Voshin, his personal legacy, his principles, the trust he embedded in his son, was the true prize. Back at Stratton Systems, Tyron's office was silent but for the low buzz of the security monitors. He sat in his chair, shoulders squared but tense, reviewing the flight footage once more. Frame by frame, he scrutinized every movement, every hesitation. The scene that had haunted him most, the moment before Rennick zip-tied Kal-El, played out on the screen. Rennick had paused, just for a fraction of a heartbeat, a subtle flicker of doubt in his eyes. Tyron leaned closer, lips pursed, eyes narrowing. Could Rennick have once known the tenderness and fear of parenthood? Could this hesitation, fleeting as it was, hint at a deeper, hidden conflict? The possibility left a shadow on Tyron's mind, an unease that coiled like smoke in the corners of the room. He shook his head slightly, forcing himself to focus on what mattered most, securing the world his son would inherit, shaping a reality where Kal-El's safety and agency could never be compromised again. Kal-El sat quietly beside his father, his small hands holding a sketchbook. The events of the flight had left impressions that words could not capture, so he had drawn instead. Tyron noticed the subtle curve of Kal-El's brow, the deliberate patience in his movements. Without a word, the boy slid the sketchbook across the polished desk toward him. Tyron opened it carefully, pages crisp beneath his fingers, and found a short, simple message in Kal-El's handwriting. "Next time, give me something I can't lose." Tyron's chest tightened, a mixture of pride, relief, and melancholy filling him. He studied the words, savoring the clarity in their simplicity. In that moment, he understood a truth deeper than any encryption or protocol could encode. Legacy was not about the items one passed down, the data one safeguarded, or the systems one built. It was about what those who received it chose to carry forward, the weight they bore willingly, and the lessons they chose to internalize. The office was silent except for the low whir of the monitors and the subtle tapping of fingers on the desk as Tyron leaned back, absorbing the resonance of Kal-El's message. He allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form. There was a gravity in this realization, a quiet triumph hidden beneath the exhaustion of the last few days. He had faced a direct attack on his principles and on his son, a threat that had sought to exploit trust and love for gain. And yet, through resilience, clarity, and careful foresight, he had preserved both. Tyron's eyes lingered on the message one final time before closing the sketchbook gently, feeling the weight of it in his hands, a tangible symbol of trust and understanding between father and son. He looked over at Kal-El, whose gaze was steady, unflinching, yet imbued with the quiet wisdom of experience beyond his years. The moment lingered, a pause between the chaos of the world and the calm of their shared bond. Tyron's mind drifted briefly to Rennick, the man who had tried to weaponize their connection, and to the systems that had been tested so brutally. The lesson, however, was clear. No algorithm, no cipher, no protocol could replace the choices made by those who truly carried their own agency. Security, inheritance, trust, they were all measured not in objects or codes, but in intention and understanding. Tyron exhaled slowly, shoulders loosening for the first time in days, as the weight of potential danger receded into the background. Finally, he turned fully to Kal-El, voice low, steady, and carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had faced a direct threat and emerged unbroken. Legacy isn't what you pass down. It's what they choose to carry. 6 months later, the auditorium buzzed with anticipation as the Summit of Tech Ethics prepared to commence. Rows of polished seats gleamed under the soft overhead lights, each filled with executives, engineers, policymakers, and journalists, their eyes fixed on the stage where the world's foremost innovators would share insights into the future of technology. Among the crowd, whispers traveled like electric currents. Stratton Systems' name was on everyone's lips, but this time it carried reverence rather than skepticism. Genlock had become a paradigm shift, adopted across healthcare networks, aerospace corporations, and government agencies, and its implementation had dramatically reshaped the conversation around ethical inheritance and digital security. The subtle hum of expectation was punctuated by the occasional shuffle of papers and quiet clicks of cameras. Tyron Voshin stepped onto the stage, moving with the calm, measured gait that had defined him through decades of innovation. His tailored dark suit contrasted sharply with the bright lights above, yet he carried no overt sense of grandeur, just a resolute presence that commanded attention. The audience leaned forward instinctively, sensing the weight of the man before them. Tyron paused, letting the silence stretch just enough to convey that what he was about to say mattered far beyond the confines of this room. He opened his speech with a deliberate quietness, his voice low, almost a whisper, yet perfectly audible across the auditorium. A stranger zip-tied my son to an armrest, using a gift I gave with pride. The words landed like a stone thrown into still water. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some gasped softly. Others exchanged glances, unsure how to reconcile the image of a father's child in peril with the man standing before them. Tyron allowed the weight of the moment to linger. But the weapon didn't win. The lesson did. His eyes scanned the room, steady and unwavering, conveying a confidence born not of bravado, but of experience and survival. In the front row, Kal-El sat quietly, his posture straight, hands folded neatly in his lap. A subtle pin adorned his blazer, a simplified silhouette of the ceremonial blade that had once been at the center of chaos. Unlike the original, it was crafted from recycled aluminum, its muted shine a testament to the careful balance between symbolism and practicality. Kal-El's gaze was fixed firmly on his father, absorbing every word, every inflection. Though silent, his presence radiated both reassurance and pride, a quiet echo of the bond that had been tested and emerged unbroken. Tyron's eyes found Kal-El's for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The trials of the past had forged something neither technology nor malice could erode. As Tyron continued, his speech wove technical insight with personal reflection. He spoke of the principles behind Genlock, the real-time consent of heir and originator, the ethical safeguards against misuse of legacy-linked encryption, the philosophical imperatives that guided its creation. His hands moved subtly, emphasizing key points, fingers brushing against the lectern for grounding. "Don't just code for what your children will open," he said, voice unwavering. "Code for what you pray they'll never need to close." A hush fell over the audience as the weight of the statement sank in. In that moment, the room became acutely aware that this was more than an academic or corporate directive. It was a moral instruction, an intimate reflection on the vulnerabilities of trust, legacy, and human connection. Applause erupted, initially polite and measured, then swelling into genuine, heartfelt acclaim. Hands rose across the auditorium, some clapping, others snapping photos, the sound a wave of acknowledgement that resonated with Tyron on a deeper level. Yet, amid the standing ovation and the flashing lights, his gaze returned instinctively to Kal-El. The boy's quiet nod, subtle yet emphatic, reached Tyron more profoundly than any clamor of praise. In that silent gesture, Tyron perceived the ultimate affirmation, understanding, resilience, and the transmission of wisdom across generations. The threat that had once sought to exploit their bond had failed, not through brute force or legal maneuvering alone, but through the mutual trust and intentional legacy shared between father and son. As the applause continued to crescendo around him, Tyron allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He felt the full arc of tension, fear, and resolution settle like a tide within him. The story of that flight, the zip tie, the ceremonial knife, the attempted sabotage, had transformed into something far greater, a demonstration of ethical fortitude and the enduring power of guidance and trust. He knew that the path forward was fraught with evolving technological challenges, yet this moment crystallized the principle that would guide his and Kal-El's journey in both life and innovation. The bond that had been tested in the narrow aisles of a plane had become the cornerstone of a movement, one that would define Genlock not just as a protocol, but as a living testament to human responsibility. In the stillness that followed the applause, Tyron allowed the truth of their experience to resonate quietly with the room. He did not need to elaborate, for the lesson had already been felt. His eyes lingered one last time on Kal-El, whose calm, attentive gaze reflected courage matured beyond his years. The audience slowly absorbed the weight of the moment, leaving an indelible impression that extended beyond technical blueprints or corporate accolades. Tyron knew the work was far from over. Challenges and threats would inevitably arise. But in this instant, with the boy beside him and the principles of ethical inheritance firmly established, he allowed a small, faint smile to emerge. The war over legacy was ongoing, but the foundation had been secured. The final words hung in the air, deliberate and true. They tried to hack the bloodline, but they couldn't overwrite the bond. Late one evening, Tyron returned to his private study, the house silent except for the faint hum of the city outside. The study was bathed in soft amber light, the polished wood of the shelves reflecting the glow. His gaze fell immediately on the sealed case that had once held the ceremonial knife, the blade that had carried the weight of both legacy and danger. He approached it slowly, his hand hovering above the latch. The memories surged, the tension in the cabin, the desperate clarity in Kal-El's eyes, the code phrases whispered in tandem to halt the upload. Tyron did not open the case. He had no need. The blade's purpose had been fulfilled, its lessons etched into memory, far more powerful than its steel or inscription. Instead, he reached for another item on the shelf, sliding it gently into place beside the case. Kal-El's sketchbook. The edges were worn from frequent handling, the cover smudged with pencil marks, fingerprints, and small, almost imperceptible stains. Tyron flipped it open carefully, savoring the tactile reassurance of the paper beneath his fingertips. The pages were a kaleidoscope of shapes and symbols, shields interlocking with keys, open hands reaching toward light, sequences of arrows, and coded lines that mirrored the protective logic Tyron had instilled. Each drawing was a testament not only to Kal-El's creativity, but to his understanding of responsibility, inheritance, and trust. Tyron's chest tightened with a mix of pride and lingering fear. He saw the danger, Tyron whispered to himself, and chose to translate it into something enduring, something constructive. On the last page, a single drawing captured Tyron's attention. It depicted a quiet moment from the flight. Kal-El sitting steady, Tyron kneeling beside him, mouths barely moving as they recited the fail-safe code together. The surrounding chaos was absent. The zip tie, the flickering lights, the frantic passengers, none of it intruded. Only focus, only connection. Tyron allowed himself a rare smile, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He traced the lines of the drawing with his finger, each stroke a reminder that Kal-El had not only survived the ordeal, but had internalized its essence. The boy had understood the significance of what was entrusted to him, transforming fear into agency. Tyron placed the book down and settled into his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. The room was still, yet a message glowed faintly on his secure tablet, breaking the silence. Veilspark server base traced to Belvin Coast. Doran's name appeared as the sender, a quiet prompt demanding review. Tyron leaned forward, the amber light casting shadows across his face, highlighting the fine lines of worry etched over the past months. He studied the message, weighing the implications. Veilspark's reach had been extensive, targeting legacy tech with surgical precision. If left unchecked, it could compromise not only Stratton's systems, but the very principles Tyron had instilled in his son. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, a moment of reflection before action. Finally, he typed, "Send me the manifest." Each key pressed with deliberate care, Tyron's mind running through contingencies, potential traps, and fail-safes. He understood that this was not merely a technical operation, but a symbolic one. The continuation of legacy, the protection of trust, and the defense of knowledge handed down through generations. His eyes shifted to the shelf, lingering on the knife and the sketchbook side by side. One represented the tangible threat, the world's attempt to twist inheritance into leverage. The other, his son's interpretation, embodied wisdom, resilience, and intention. Tyron allowed himself a measured exhale, recognizing that the true safeguard was not code or steel, but the bond that could not be broken. From elsewhere in the house, laughter floated down the hallway, light, unburdened, unmistakably Kal-El's. Tyron's gaze softened, and a faint, tired smile touched his lips. The boy was safe. The lessons had been absorbed. But Tyron knew the war over inheritance was far from over. There would be challenges, attempts to manipulate what they held dear, tests of vigilance, and cunning adversaries. Yet in that moment, he understood something deeper. The defense had begun, and it was rooted in more than protocols and encryption. It was rooted in wisdom, trust, and intentional choice. Tyron's thoughts returned to the flight, to the panic, to the calm determination Kal-El had displayed. He closed the sketchbook gently, aligning it perfectly with the sealed case beside it. A quiet resolve settled over him, his mind already calculating the next steps, anticipating potential vulnerabilities, planning strategic countermeasures. The foundation of defense was established, and though the path ahead would demand courage and ingenuity, the bond between father and son was unassailable. Tyron stood, glancing one last time at the pair of items. The silence of the study was profound, punctuated only by the distant, reassuring echo of his son's laughter. He gave the boy a blade, and the boy gave it back as wisdom. In seconds, the father's intervention neutralized the threat, freed his son, and left the flight crew frozen in shock. The knife, a symbol of trust turned upside down, became the evidence that dismantled the attendant's arrogance completely. If you believe real authority acts with precision, foresight, and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the courage it takes to protect loved ones under threat. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and spark reflection on accountability, integrity, and the protection of the vulnerable.